Some people feel that theology is very unimportant in Judaism. You'll sometimes hear the idea that Judaism is about deed rather than creed, meaning to say God gives you commandments, God gives you actions to do, and God gives you actions to avoid, and one does not necessarily have to examine the theological principles behind those actions other than believing in God, that God gave the mitzvos. That actually happens to be my position as well. But there are many that do talk about the fact that Judaism also has certain dogmas, certain theological constructs, not very many. And I want to talk a little bit about the history of that and then in terms of what those principles might be. We know that Maimonides, one of the greatest of our rabbis, Maimonides really had a triple hitter. Maimonides had 3 great careers at one time. The least important was he happened to have been a very eminent physician, one of the great physicians of the medieval period, but that's kind of relatively minor in the long-range thing. Number 2, he was one of our greatest religious philosophers, in which he attempted to synthesize Aristotelian philosophy and Jewish tradition, and that was his famous book, The Guide to the Perplexed, dealing with people who were very exposed to Aristotle, who was the philosopher that was the most widely studied in the Middle Ages. Of course, Aristotle is from the ancient world, but through Arabic commentators, his words were preserved in the Middle Ages. In Islamic countries, although Christian countries were going through the Dark Ages. It's very interesting. At that point in time, the height of civilization was Islam. What happened afterwards is another story, and that is, of course, Bernard Lewis's famous book. I don't remember the exact title, but something like What Happened, meaning what happened to the Arab world is a bit of a tragedy. So he was physician. He was a great, great religious philosopher. And number 3, of course, he was also one of the greatest of halachic scholars who systematically codified the entirety of Jewish law. And to this day, it is the only code that covers every single facet of Jewish law. For example, even the Shulchan Aruch, which is called the definitive code of Jewish law, does not cover things that don't apply today. For example, the Shulchan Aruch does not cover sacrifices. It does not cover some agricultural laws which did not apply outside of Israel. The Rambam, Maimonides, covers everything. Rambam, of course, is an abbreviation. Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon. He spent most of his life in Egypt, in Cairo, and he lived under Islamic domination. Now, Maimonides formulates a creed that is considered to be fairly definitive, and these are called the 13 Principles of Faith. And they are contained in his commentary to the Mishnah, but they appear in a more popular form in the back of every siddur, and after the morning service, you will find 13 Principles of Faith. We're not going to go over all of them, but basically know that there is one God, that God is one, that God is non-corporeal, God does not have a body, that God gave the Torah will never change, that there's prophecy, there is the Messiah, there is resurrection of the dead. And Maimonides took the very strong position that anyone that denied any one of these principles, for example, if you took the position the Torah could change, that God gave the Torah, but the Torah could change in time, you are classified as a heretic, and you are no longer considered to be part of the Jewish people. And Maimonides was so extreme on this that many interpret Maimonides that even if you didn't have the correct belief because of ignorance, not because of rebellion, but simply because you never learned it, It's like the admission ticket to the world to come. Just because you don't have the money, you still don't get the admission ticket, so to speak. And, as the phrase goes, a heretic is a heretic even if it's not his fault. This was Maimonides' view of the 13 principles of faith. And even today, many people say that to be a Jew in good standing, you have to subscribe to all of those 13 principles. Now, I need to just mention, for the record, a very important dissenting opinion. And this was a dissenting view of another great Jewish philosopher who lived around 200 years later. And this is Rav Yosef Albo, who lived in Italy. And Rav Yosef Albo argued that Maimonides was confusing or conflating what you might call fundamental principles with derivative principles. Rav Yosef Albo argued, although he agreed with everything Maimonides said in terms of what a Jew should believe, but he disagreed with the classification that all 13 principles are fundamental. And Rav Albo actually argued there are only 3 fundamental beliefs that a Jew must have, and then there'll be subsidiary derivative principles that come from there. But as long as you believe in the fundamental, even if you're either ignorant or you disbelieve a derivative, you might be mistaken, you might be foolish, you might be dumb, but being stupid is not the same as being a heretic. Now, the 3 fundamental principles that Rav Albo articulates are the existence of a single God that created heaven and earth. I believe in God. Number 2, the existence of a reward and punishment mechanism, either in this world or the world to come. Because without reward or punishment, there's no accountability. There is no justice. There is no reason to be good because there'll be no benefit for it. And there's no reason to avoid evil because there'll be no consequence. So it is mukhrach, meaning it is a forced conclusion that if God created man to live a certain way, there must be some type of reward and punishment system in place. And the third fundamental principle is there was divine revelation of what God's will is, because otherwise we would have no way to know what is good and what is evil. Now, how is Rav Albo differing from the Rambam? So let's take a concrete example. Let's say a person does not believe in a personal Mashiach, right, some Redeemer. Now, that's certainly against the general teachings of Judaism that believes in a Mashiach. According to the Rambam, such a person would be a heretic. Such a person would be excluded from the Jewish people. According to Rav Albo, we would describe it a different way. As long as I do believe there is a reward and punishment mechanism, even if I believe it's in the world to come, it's the world of the soul, and there's not going to be a flesh and blood Mashiach, I am not a heretic. I am simply making a mistake, meaning to say the particulars of the reward and punishment, whether it's the Messiah, whether it's the world to come, whether it's resurrection of the dead, Rav Albo argued are derivative principles. They are not fundamental principles. And because they are derivative principles, a person might be mistaken as to the derivative principles and would still be a Jew in good standing. Again, the reason I'm making this clear is because some have made the argument that Rav Albo is essentially denying the idea of Mashiach. Absolutely not. He is not denying the idea of Mashiach. He is simply stating it is not a fundamental, it is a derivative. So in some ways, everybody agrees as to what Jews should believe. They're simply arguing what are the consequences of not believing it. And Maimonides has these 13 principles of faith, and Rav Yosef Albo has 3 fundamental principles of faith. The idea of God as creator, the idea of God who creates accountability for goodness and evil, and the God that communicated his will through divine revelation. Okay, so there was a whole argument in Jewish philosophy that continues to this very day as to how many dogmas Judaism has and whether Judaism is based on these dogmas at all, or it's simply based on the notion that there is a God and God gave us a Torah. Now, let me mention a third work. So I've mentioned so far the Guide to the Perplexed that was written in the 11th century, and Rav Yosef Albo that was written in the end of the 13th century. Let me mention a book and a philosopher that is even earlier than Maimonides. And we might call him the anti-philosopher. And this is Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, who also lived in Spain. Before Maimonides was born in Spain, but lived in Egypt. Yehuda Halevi actually lived in Spain, and this was during what was called the Golden Age of Spain, when Jews were very, very prominent in the arts and in the sciences and in politics. And Rav Yehuda Halevi had a multifaceted career. Rav Yehuda Halevi was, of course, a rabbi. He was a physician, but his love was actually poetry. And he wrote thousands and thousands of poems, many of which are religious poetry, but he also wrote about wine and song and love. He wrote secular poetry as well, which we tend not to look at in the yeshiva world, but indeed he was a man of the world in every sense. And he lived in a society that is not too different than the United States. It was a society at a time where Jews were given political and social and economic rights. Remember, the Jews were expelled from Spain in 1492, but this is way before that. It was a time in which many Jews were assimilated to the prevailing culture. And even Jews who may have been halachically observant were not infused with the passion of Judaism, because their passion was predominantly in that culture. And Rav Yehuda Halevi himself in his youth was kind of that way. He was always halachically observant, but his passions were in that general culture. And towards the end of his life, he actually went through what you might call a religious epiphany, to borrow a Christian phrase, that he saw a certain shallowness and emptiness in the secular, decadent life of the pleasures of the flesh. And he resolved that he wanted to die in the land of Israel. Now, I want to point out, going to the land of Israel in the 11th century is not like coming to the land of Israel in the 21st century. I can assure you they didn't have Ben & Jerry's ice cream or Skippy peanut butter or cell phones. Life was extremely hard. He was leaving an affluent, comfortable existence where he was wealthy, well-regarded, and going to a place that was desolate, empty, abandoned, dangerous. Dangerous in all ways. The trip was dangerous. Living in Jerusalem itself, let's say, you could be attacked by wild animals, by marauders, by Arabs. Well, some things don't change, indeed, and the like. And yet, his desire to be close to God was so strong that he was willing to sacrifice all the material comforts of the diaspora to spend his last days in the house of God. And he undertook that great voyage with great, great, great personal sacrifice. Now, whether he got to Israel, historically we're not really sure. There are two different accounts of how Rav Yehuda Halevi ended his life. Account number one is he never made it. Account number one is he got as far as Alexandria in Egypt, and he died in Alexandria before he ever got to Eretz Yisrael. But there is an account number two that some say is a legend, so I can't vouch for its accuracy, that he actually came to the gates of Jerusalem and he prostrated himself on the ground, kissing the dirt, kissing the stones. And as he was crying and sobbing in both joy and in sadness that we don't have a temple and the like, the legend has it an Arab horseman drove by and pierced him with a spear. And he died by the very gates of Jerusalem without ever entering the city. Who knows? This is a well-beloved and often repeated story. We're not entirely sure if it is true or not. But these types of stories, even if they're not factually true, are emotionally true, because it certainly expresses the feelings that Rav Yehuda Halevi had towards Eretz Yisrael, towards Jerusalem. Now, why am I bringing this in? Because shortly before he left, in the last years of his life in Spain, he wrote a book, a very, very famous book of Jewish philosophy that is even earlier than Maimonides. And this book is called The Kuzari. And maybe you've heard of it, maybe you've read it a little bit, maybe you've read about it. But it's a very, very fascinating book because it is a philosophical treatise that is really kind of a historical novel, meaning to say he used a historical event that had occurred several hundred years earlier, and he kind of fictionalized it and made it the basis of his philosophical study. And this was the story of the Khazar nation. The Khazars were a group of warlike tribes that lived in Russia. This goes back to the 900s. This goes back a long way. And the Khazars, somehow, the whole nation, converted to Judaism. Now, that's pretty fascinating because so many people who are Jewish want to get out of it, and it's highly unusual that in a culture which was so overwhelmingly either Christian or Muslim, that a whole nation would convert to Judaism. And these were not people who were like very unusual people as well, because these were not the people who sat in the Beis Medrash and learned Torah. This was a warrior nation. These were tough guys, and they just converted to Judaism. So you could imagine. Now, the Khazars, by the way, are now considered to be extinct. They eventually intermingled with other tribes, and we don't know who they are, where they are. They're kind of gone. Although there is a theory. Now, it's a discarded academic theory, but there was an academic theory that was very popular, that most Ashkenazic Jews are descended from the Khazars, because that explains some of the ethnic and racial problems we have in Jewish identity. Because after all, if the Jewish people from Abraham are a Mid-Eastern people, the people that come from Babylonia, etc., then we should have darker complexions and the like. Why do Ashkenazic Jews have light complexions and the like? And some have surmised that Ashkenazim are descended not from the indigenous Jewish nation, but they're descended from the Khazars. Okay, but that's, as I say, there's a lot of debate and discussion about that, and I don't necessarily want to focus too much on it. But be it as it may, the story of this Khazar nation converting to Judaism exerted a great, great interest in people's imagination. Who were these people? Why did they do it? And the story that was preserved was because the king had a dream. The king of the Khazars, his name was King Bulan. The king of the Khazars had a dream in which an angel of God appeared to him and said, "Your intentions and your desires are worthy and noble, but your actions are not correct. Find the path of truth." And legend had it, this was already a legend in Rabbi Halevi's time, that the king was a seeker of truth, so he summoned, sounds like an old joke, he summoned a priest and a Muslim, an imam, and an atheistic philosopher to kind of teach him what is the pathway of life. And he didn't like what he heard. And he didn't even bother asking a rabbi because he said the Jews certainly don't have it. But then he figured if all of those other ways didn't work, he'll try the Jew, hear what the Jew says. And this was the story that the Jew convinced him, and he converted to Judaism. Now, this was a very fragmentary story, just a legend, a story that was preserved. Historically, it was true that the Khazars underwent a mass conversion, but the idea of the angel, that we don't know if that happened or not. But Rav Yehuda Halevi took that story and he constructed a dialogue between the rabbi and the king of the Khazars, in which the king of the Khazars raised all of his questions about Judaism, and the rabbi answered it. And Rav Yehuda Halevi used that dramatic structure. Only a poet would write a philosophical book like that. Maimonides, you could not imagine Maimonides writing a book of that nature. Maimonides was a philosopher, so he expounded philosophy. Rav Yehuda Halevi was a poet philosopher, so he uses a literary structure to convey the truths of Judaism. But you have to understand that everything is made up. In other words, the whole dialogue is made up. In fact, even when the king asks questions, it's not really the king that's asking the questions. It's Rav Yehuda Halevi putting the questions in the king's mouth, and then the rabbi is Rav Yehuda Halevi giving the answer, etc. And he uses this story as the background. So what makes the Kuzari interesting is, number one, that the questions are questions that a Jewish person might ask, because essentially the king is Rav Yehuda Halevi and the rabbi is Rav Yehuda Halevi, and he's addressing both points. Okay, so the Kuzari is a work of Jewish philosophy, but in many, many ways, it is a profoundly anti-philosophical work. Because Rav Yehuda Halevi was deeply convinced that the deepest truths of life are based on experience rather than rational syllogistic thought. Meaning, the way one knows that there's a God, the way one knows the truths of the Torah, is not by philosophically proving them, but it's based on the experience of the Exodus and the experience of Revelation. He makes an interesting point, which again is a poet's point, but it's very interesting. He compares philosophers and poets, and he says the following. He says that there are people who know the laws of grammar and know the laws of meter and know the rules for syllable length, but they don't know how to write a poem. They just know all the rules, but they can't do anything with it. And then there are people, he said, who intuitively know how to use language, even though they don't necessarily know the rules of grammar. I mean, think about how a child learns language. I mean, this is why it's so difficult for an adult to learn a language. Because when you sit down, you want to learn Hebrew, you want to learn French, you want to learn Russian, whatever language you want to learn. So you start memorizing grammar, subjects and verbs and predicate nominatives and adjectives and modifications and gerunds. But that's not a natural way of speaking. In other words, when I have to say something, I have to think, do I want to use the adjective before or after? When you kind of have to speak a language based on a self-conscious awareness of rules, you're not going to do very well. But a child picks up language intuitively by hearing words, by just being exposed into an environment. So Rav Yehuda Halevi said, religious truths are not always susceptible to philosophical proof, but they are based on deep intuition, and they are based on historical experience. So although it is a book of philosophy in many, many ways, you can actually sense he has an antipathy towards philosophers who believe that reason is the source of all virtue, when in fact sometimes there is direct, unmediated experience of God that is not always susceptible to rational demonstration. So now, I know this is a little abstract, but now let me just give you concretely what the Kuzari does. When the Kuzari, well, the Kuzari is the name of the book, but when the king of the Khazars asks the rabbi, how do you know that Judaism is true? How do you know that the God of Israel is the God that we should worship? Maybe not. Maybe he doesn't exist. Maybe all of these things are made up. So the Kuzari said that the veracity of Judaism is based on historical experience that cannot be falsified. Now, he is not the first one who made this argument. There was actually an earlier philosopher, Rav Sadia Gaon, who was actually the first Jewish philosopher. But Rav Yehuda Halevi kind of plagiarized this idea and developed this idea much more. And that is the following. All religious traditions, all religions, are based on on revelation, that God appeared. But Judaism is unique because it is the only religion that is based on mass revelation. So, let's take an example. If I want to convince you to follow me, right? I want to convince you that I am a man of God, I am a prophet. And I come to you and I say, God spoke to me. God gave me commandments. God gave me directions. If you trust me, if you believe in me, if I've given you reason, I'm not saying that you have that reason, but let's assume that, I've done good things for you, I've been a good leader. So it's possible for me to convince you that God appeared to me. Now, maybe I'm lying. Maybe I had hallucinations. Maybe I'm imagining things. But if you trust me enough and I'm persuasive enough and I'm charismatic enough, I might be able to convince you that God appeared to me and you should be my followers. And eventually, as I start off with 10 followers, the 10 will talk to other people, and eventually that might spread. So theoretically, it's entirely possible to have a religion that is based on a claim of a revelation to only a small number of people that may eventually have millions of adherents. Because as long as the founder was believable, trustworthy, charismatic, he might be lying, he might be hallucinating, but once he's believed, that's going to be fine. But Rav Yehuda Levi says, a claim that God appeared to me is not the same as a claim that God appeared to you. Meaning, two claims. If I say God appeared to me, I might be able to convince you. But if I say God appeared to you, that's a much more difficult claim to convince somebody of, because you're going to scratch your head and say, you know, I just don't remember that happening. And certainly a claim that God appeared to millions and millions of people, how does such a lie start? Who is going to believe such a lie? How are 1 million people or 3 million people going to be convinced that something like that actually happened? Unless, of course, it did happen. So the Kuzari's argument is that Judaism, when I say the Kuzari, I mean the book Kuzari, but actually it's the rabbi in the Kuzari. The Kuzari's argument is that Judaism makes a claim that is so preposterous that it would never be believed unless it actually happened. Meaning, if you take Christianity, God appeared to Jesus and the apostles, or Jesus was God, whatever it is, you're dealing with small numbers. You're dealing with small groups, even whatever miracle. And second of all, I should also emphasize that even ideas of miracles, walking on water, or the bread and the fish, all of those different miracles, they were still in front of small numbers of people. They were not in front of millions and millions of people. So Rav Yehuda Levi says that the historicity of the revelation at Sinai and of the Exodus of Egypt was making a claim that could not have been falsified precisely because it was so audacious. It was not a claim of revelation to a small number of people. It was a claim of revelation to a huge number of people. Now, let me clarify one point. You might say, well, aren't you going in circles? Because you're saying Judaism is based on the fact that God gave us the Torah at Mount Sinai. But I don't believe that God gave the Torah at Mount Sinai. I don't believe that event happened. But here is the subtlety in the analysis. There's one thing you're going to have to admit, and that is, even if you want to say the revelation at Sinai did not happen, the one thing you cannot deny as a matter of history is that 500 years ago, or 300 years ago, or even 200 years ago, the majority of the Jewish people believed that it happened. Now, that is empirically demonstrable. I cannot empirically show you the revelation happened, but I can empirically show you that most of the Jewish people believed the revelation happened. See, that's a different semantic. I don't have to go back 3,000 years for that. I just have to go back 200 years. Now, the Kuzari would say, how did you ever get into a state where a majority of the Jewish people believed that something like that happened? How does such a lie start? There is no basis for implanting that belief among a large number of people. So the Kuzari grounds the veracity of Judaism on the non-falsibility of the revelation at Sinai, in contradistinction to other religions that posit divine revelation to only a small number. In fact, this has become so well known, such a well-known argument, that although the Kuzari is not the first one who said it, but this is called the Kuzari principle. And it is sharply debated. I'm not here to give you an ironclad defense. Actually, my colleague, another teacher here that hopefully you've had, Rabbi Gottlieb, he has almost made his career in writing hundreds and hundreds of pages in elaborating the Kuzari argument. But my job today is simply to throw it out, to expose you to it, to understand that a claim of mass revelation is a qualitatively different claim than a claim that God has appeared only to a small number. Because a claim that God has appeared to a small number is a falsifiable claim. It is a claim that can result from hallucination or deliberate deception. But a claim that God appeared to all, again, think about it in this way. I could convince you, perhaps, that God appeared to me. I certainly couldn't convince all of you that God appeared to all of you, if, as far as you know, he didn't. And then you multiply it by millions of people. There were 3 million people at Sinai. Why do I get the 3 million number? Because the Torah records, again, it's an estimate, but the Torah records that there were 603,000 Jews who left Egypt. But that only includes men between the age of 20 and 60. So you have men and children below the age of 20. You have older people above the age of 60. And you have women. So the standard, relatively conservative estimate is, if you have a population base of 600,000 between 20 and 60, including women, children, and older people, you'll get a 3 million population. So our claim is that God appeared to 3 million people. And God gave them the 10 Commandments. And they heard, I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt. How do you start that lie? Everyone wakes up in the morning and simply, is there a mass conspiracy where everybody decides we're going to tell our kids this happened? Again, is it possible? It is possible. Is it plausible? No. Again, in life, you need to be rational in terms of assessing possibilities. People say, anything could happen. Some have suggested that the Torah was written by aliens, a super advanced civilization that simply put all sorts of things in the world. Well, things are possible, but it certainly makes more sense that this was believed rather than deliberately falsified on that type of level. Okay, so this is the Kuzari's argument, and again, he prefers to ground religious belief on experiential Judaism rather than philosophical syllogistic proofs. Okay, it's called the Kuzari principle. Now, I will say that the notion of experience is very, very relevant in other ways as well. Rav Yehuda Halevi is, of course, referring to the Exodus and the giving of the Torah. But in truth, I think you will find that as you experience Judaism in terms of living Judaism, you will find that there's a certain spiritual power that cannot be totally captured in words. There was a great rabbi who once said that Charles Darwin was able to believe that man came from ape only because he never met the great Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, who was one of the great righteous people. If he would have met the great Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, he would have known only God could make such a person. Meaning he would have seen righteousness, he would have seen holiness. Now, that's not a philosophical argument. Rabbi Yisrael Salanter could theoretically be a product of evolution as much as anybody else. But there's kind of an intuitive argument that when you see holiness and you see sanctity, you know there must be more here at stake than simply random biochemical evolution. And that is part of Rav Yehuda Halevi's argument about the depths of intuition and the like. And once again, if you think about your own lives, most of the deepest ideas that motivate us, that animate us, are really supra-rational. In fact, I will even tell you that even the motivation of the scientist is ultimately an irrational. A person has a passion for science. You're a Stephen Hawking. You're an Einstein. What are you looking for in science? You're looking for some elegant structure in which a multiplicity of phenomena can be reduced to a few principles. And of course, the ultimate goal of physics is TOE, theory of everything. You want to reduce the complexity of the universe to a certain single principle that will explain everything. If you think about this, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, who says the universe has to be elegant? Who says it has to be non-chaotic? Who says there has to be order and structure? And who says things have to make sense? What is the whole search for scientific laws, if not in irrational, non-scientific intuition that there's some beauty and structure in this multiplicity? So the very foundations of science are profoundly irrational. The search for rationality stems from an irrational, unexplainable phenomenon that things got to make sense. Why do things have to make sense? You can't explain that rationally, actually. In other words, there's something irrational in us that says there got to be a sense to this. So, in a sense, the very philosophical quest, maybe I'm double talking here, but the very philosophical quest is grounded in non-philosophical premises. At some point in your existence, you're going to hit an iron wall in which you cannot philosophically defend any proposition. But you just know it's there. There's like a first principle beyond which you're not going to go. And that's really Rabbi Levi's take on religious experience. Who was it? Was it Kurt Gödel? Kurt Gödel, very, very famous mathematician, absolutely brilliant person. He demonstrated that all mathematical theorems that seem to be so rigorously logical are ultimately based on unprovable premises. That's Gödel's theorem. A little story about Gödel just reminds me, apropos of nothing. You know, Gödel immigrated to the United States, and he was working at Princeton. Princeton has this Center for Advanced Studies, which you don't have to teach. So, you know, geniuses just work there. Einstein, for example, was there. So when Gödel applied for citizenship, so, you know, he had to take a little test on the Constitution. So because Gödel was so brilliant, he analyzed the Constitution, and he came up with the fact that the whole United States government system is incoherent and self-contradictory and logically does not make sense. He was applying his theorem to the Constitution. So he was about to tell the judge all of this, to demonstrate the inherent incoherence of the American Constitution. Einstein talked him out of it. Einstein took him to the court for citizenship. Einstein talked him out of it and said, you know, we could talk about this another time. Just answer the simple questions, or you might not get your American citizenship. But the point I'm making is that the deepest meanings of our lives are actually not going to be defensible with pure philosophy. Philosophy works on derivatives, meaning once you have your fundamental ideas, so philosophy can explore the implications, can explore the limits, can tell you how far to go, and then you use rationality. Rationality is, of course, very important, but rationality cannot always define what I love, what I care about, what I would give my life about, etc. And again, this is why for the non-rationalist, the Kuzari has a special attraction, because it does pose a model beyond the rigid scholasticism of the Aristotelian model. And again, Rabbi Levi comes from this because in his youth, in his younger years, he indeed was an Aristotelian, perhaps an Aristotelian hedonist, kind of combining the two. But then he matured to a greater level of spiritual introspection, recognizing that it is often experience of life and intuition that brings a person to a deeper place than they would be with mere naked philosophy. Okay, so this is a bit of an introduction. Now again, how does one ultimately approach God? It really depends on the people. I mean, each of us has different orientations. So some will be more philosophically oriented, some will be less so. But I think it is important to know that even one's inclination to philosophy is ultimately irrational because it is a search for rationality, and there's no a priori reason why the world has to be rational. That is kind of just the first premise that cannot in itself be philosophically defended. But be it as it may, at least part of your lexicon should be the Kuzari principle, and that is the uniqueness of Judaism's claim that God's revelation was not to a small number of people, which is a falsifiable proposition, but was to a mass revelation, which is a non-falsifiable proposition, because that is a lie that simply could not have been introduced in society at any time because it immediately would have been discredited. I mean, no matter when it was introduced. If it was introduced at Sinai, the 3 million people would say, I don't remember hearing God. And if it was introduced 100 years ago, then the kids who are hearing it would say, gee, how come mom and dad never told us that? So no matter when you make up the story, I mean, be a skeptic. Say it's a made-up story. But just ask yourself the question, okay, when would it have been made up? 1,000 years ago? 2,000 years ago? How did it ever become believable? See, that's Rabbi Levi's argument. There's no way to make this up, because at any point you're going to introduce it, the kids are going to say, how come I never heard this before? So you're not going to convince the initial generation, because they said, God didn't talk to me. And you're not going to convince a later generation, oh, God spoke to your grandparents, because they're going to say, how come they never told me about it? Okay, that's the argument. You can play with it again if you're interested in pursuing it. If you're not going to hear Rabbi Gottlieb's actual lectures, if you go to his website, you can see a spirited debate and a give and take on this Kuzari principle. But as I say, I just want you to be aware of it, to know it, to think about it. And then, you know, obviously you'll have your own questions and cogitations, and that's perfectly fine. But be aware that this is the famous thesis of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. Now, let me make the point, though, that there's an interesting argument. How much of God's words did the Jewish people hear at Mount Sinai? Because if you read the book of Deuteronomy, God gives the 10 Commandments, which are actually more than 10, actually, but those 10 statements. And then the Jewish people go to Moses, and they're so terrified at God's voice and the thunder and the lightning and all of the effects. You've seen the movie, right? And it was much more than that. So they go to Moshe and they say to Moshe, Moshe, we really don't have the strength and the power to hear God's words directly. Can you be our intermediary? So it is interesting that Judaism does not claim there was mass revelation on all of the 613 commandments of the Torah. There was only mass revelation of the 10 commandments, but as part of that revelation, they heard from God that Moses would be the authorized representative. And then Moses went to Sinai, Mount Sinai, for 40 days and 40 nights. And that is where God gave him the 613 commandments, which he then communicated to us. So according to the simple meaning of Deuteronomy, the Jewish people only heard the 10 commandments. There actually is an even more extreme view, according to the Gemara in Maseches Makos, that the Jewish people didn't even hear the 10 commandments. They only heard the first of the first two of the 10 commandments. I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt, and thou shalt not have any other gods. And that's when we broke down. And the Gemara in Makos gives a very ingenious interpretation of why do we say the two are different than the other ones. Because like this, we have a tradition of the rabbis that how many commandments are there in the Torah? 613. 613. Now, a lot of those commandments don't apply today, etc., but there are 613 commandments. 248 thou shalt do, and 365 thou shalt not do. That's the breakup. By the way, this is not so easy to figure out, because if you open up a Torah and write down every command statement, you will get like 5,000 commands. So there's a whole problem. How do you get 613? So obviously what you're doing is you're taking, for example, if the Torah says bring a sin offering, and it says do A, B, C, D, C, D, we don't count it as 30 commandments. There's one mitzvah that has many subcomponents. I mean, there's a whole theory of classification. But be it as it may, we go to number 613. But there's a verse in the Torah that says, Torah siva lanu Moshe. Moshe gave us Torah. Now, are you familiar with gematria? Gematria is a simple basis of biblical interpretation, where every letter of the Hebrew alphabet is also given a number, just like A could be 1. So in the Hebrew alphabet, every letter can also be a number. So Torah, Moshe gave us the Torah. Gematria of Torah. First letter, Taf, 400. Second letter, Vav, 6. Third letter, Resh, 200. 606, Hey, 5. Gematria of Torah, add the digits, 611. So the Talmud asks the obvious question. If God gave us 613, why does it say Moshe gave us 611? Answer, we heard 2 of them from God, and Moshe gave us the other 611. That's exactly the interpretation. That total of the Torah is 613. Moshe gave us 611 of them. We heard directly from God the first 2. Now, based on that, though, let me leave you with a final question. So it turns out that the first 2 of the 10 commandments are 2 of the 613. Now, a commandment is when God tells you to do something or not to do something. But the so-called first commandment is a sentence. It is not a commandment. I am the Lord your God, who took you out of the land of Egypt from the house of slavery. Period. End of first commandment. What is that sentence commanding? Now, the second one is a commandment. Thou shalt not have any other gods. That's commanding me not to worship other gods. But the first sentence is a declaration. I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt. How is that a commandment? So Maimonides actually says it is the commandment to believe in God. Now this raises a logical conundrum. How can there be a commandment to believe in God? If I don't believe in God, then what is the authority of that commandment? It's like telling an atheist, you must believe in God. And the atheist asks me, why? And I say, because God says so. Yeah, but I don't believe in God. In other words, faith in God, it is difficult to conceptualize as a commandment. Because until you have that faith, there's nobody that's giving you the commandment that you have to listen to. So Ramban, these are 2 rabbis you should be aware of. I've spoken throughout the hour about Rambam, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon. But there was another rabbi, the generation later, who is Nachmanides. There's Maimonides, son of Maimon, and there's Nachmanides, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, same first name but different father. And we abbreviate them, unless you get used to the names, it's hard. One is Rambam, and the other is Ramban. These are really great. They're always fighting it out with each other, duking it out, although they did not know each other personally. And Ramban argues that there's no way you can count faith in God as one of the commandments. Faith in God is a foundational prerequisite for commandments. Once I believe in God, I then accept his commandments as binding. But one cannot say that faith in God is a commandment. Maimonides, on the other hand, does take that position. He counts it as one of the 613 commandments, belief in God. And I have to say, Maimonides has a very strong Talmudic proof, because the Talmud says that the two commandments of the Decalogue, including I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt, are one of the 613. The Gemara says it's one of the 613. So Maimonides does have a strong textual argument. Nachmanides has a strong logical argument. So this is a fascinating dispute, we'll continue it later, in which the text supports Maimonides and the logical reasoning seems to support Nachmanides. And what would Maimonides do with this logical objection? Do you understand? How can faith be commanded? Yes, God is a reality, but if I'm not yet there, there is no authority in the command. A command implies an authority to bind me. And an authority cannot be its own authority. In other words, I can't say, listen to me because I'm telling you to listen to me. You already have to know that I'm an authority before you listen to me. And that is Nachmanides' conundrum with the notion of faith. So we'll talk a little bit more about this. But again, my goal is not obviously to give you any definitive coverage of Jewish theology here, but just to expose you to the basic ideas so you can think about it, you can enlarge your reading and debates and discussions. And again, hopefully we will come back to talk about some of this a bit more. Okay, you all have a good day. We'll see you tomorrow.